Alright, welcome back to Through the Mirror Dimly. My name's Daniel Schaefer, and today I'll be continuing my quick reflections on the book of Romans. We are at one of the most famous passages here at the end of chapter 8, where last time we were discussing what it means for God to call us, how he recruits us, and that those he calls, that he names, and that when he names somebody, you are that thing. When God declared Abraham righteous, Abraham was righteous. Not through anything he did, but because he believed, he was considered righteous. And that when God calls you that, you are that thing. And just the beauty and assurance that we have, that we know God is working all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. However that verse is translated, since there are several different ways, that the message is the same, that God is working and he has given us a spirit so that we have assurance of his work, and that all things will work out in the end, even though it might not be pleasant for us in this lifetime, that in the end it will all work out for good. It wasn't pleasant for Joseph to be sold into slavery at the time, but it worked out. God worked in that. He worked using the evil intentions of his brothers to save the world from the famine. So now let's go ahead and read this passage again, and we'll talk through a couple other words that might stumble us in our understanding of this passage just because of the incredible amount of theological baggage that we all bring to these words these days. So let's go ahead and read, and then we'll dive on in. Now, in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we should. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? So again, that last verse, verse 31, just shows the point of this. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? This is such an amazing amount of assurance for those who have put their faith in Christ and are in union with Christ. So I think it's probably fairly obvious, but the two words that we're going to really talk about are predestined and foreknew. And so predestined especially has really taken on a whole other, genre than what it seems to mean, at least here. Because predestining is really the same thing as like pre-planning. I have predestined that for dinner tonight we will have pizza. I've pre-planned. This is a word that was used at the time, and that could be used to just be talking about what is to come. And so while people will talk about, isn't predestination in the Bible? And it's like, well, yes and no. Predestining is in the Bible. It is always used in a verb form. So you are predestined for something. So whenever you come across the word predestined, it is great to think, who is predestined and for what is this person predestined? So we're going to deal with this one first because then we have a lot of scriptures talking about foreknown. So in predestined, it says, he also predestined who? Those whom he foreknew. So we'll talk about foreknew in a minute. But he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. And so those he predestined, he also called. So here it is, you are the believer, those whom he called, or in this case, I'm going to make my case later, but the patriarchs of old, those throughout Israel's history, he predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. So he predestined them to be conformed to Jesus, so that Jesus would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And we see this same language used in Colossians 1:18 through 20, where it's, he is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. And so here we see this as the same thing. It's, he would be the firstborn from the dead, because all those who have put their faith in God, who have trusted in God, are conformed to the image of of the Son, and that he is now the firstborn from the dead. It's the same thing here. He predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would become the firstborn among many brothers and sisters, as this translation puts it, to just make sure we get the whole scope. So, hopefully that makes sense. He pre-planned that those who he called would be conformed to the image of his Son. If you are called, if you are invited into union with Christ, if you believe in Christ, then your destination, the path that God has planned for you, is to be conformed to his image. And you can be sure of that the Spirit is working within us. He who is being led by the Spirit is a son of God. That if your mind is set on the Spirit, then you will crucify the desires of the flesh and you will not satisfy those desires, but instead you will renew your mind and become like Christ. And so with God's help, with his Spirit working with us, groaning, interceding for us, we are destined to become like Christ, which is just absolutely a beautiful thing that God always had this in mind. It's all throughout the scriptures that he always had it in mind that those who trusted in him would be destined to become like Christ. So now, what does it mean foreknew? I've heard there's a lot of different discussions on this. Some people talk about it like foreordination. Some talk about it as if it's God looking through the corridors of time, so to speak, to see who would be there. But another option, and the one that I've always kind of taken it as, or at least as far back as I remember recently, is those who he knew before. And this is a word that only comes up about 5 times in the New Testament. So we're going to look at those and just see how the New Testament writers use this word. Because we have it here where it is those he foreknew, he also predestined. And this is where it's so important to remember the context. Because right before this verse, he says, and we know that God causes all things to work together. How do we know this? How do we know? And he says, we know this for those whom he foreknew, those who he knew before. He also predestined. This is all in the past tense. It switches to the past tense. So we know what God will do, what God has done. We know God will do what he is doing and that he will hold on to his promises, that he will work all things together because of what he has done. So we know that God causes all things to work together. For those whom he foreknew, for those who he knew before, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. And these whom he predestined, he also called. These whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. So this is all in the past tense. This is, we know what God will do. We know that we can trust in everything he has done because of what he has done before. But here, I'm going to show my work on this one because I don't want y'all to just take me at my word. So Paul also uses the same word for foreknew in Romans 11. So in this section, Romans 10:21 through 11:7, he says, but as for Israel, he says, I have spread out my hands all day long to a disobedient and obstinate people. I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? Far from it. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So this is very clearly talking about the Israelites of old. God has not rejected the people that he has known, has he? But you notice the start of the thought. It starts in 10, but chapters and verses were added later. But as for Israel, so this is the people that God has been the God to for all this time, that has given the covenants, has given all of these things, the patriarchs, the covenants, the law. I've spread out my hands all day to a disobedient and obstinate people. But God has not rejected he has not rejected them, has he? He has not rejected his people whom he knew before. So that's Paul using it in just another chapter or so. But now in Acts 26, 4 through 5, we have the same word. So then, all Jews know my way of life since my youth, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and in Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. So this is Paul talking about the fact that someone has known him. Same word, but that it is something about knowing in the past. In 1 Peter 17 through 21, if you address as the Father one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you are not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. For he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for the sake of you. So he was known before the foundation of the world, but has now appeared in these last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. So again, this is the emphasis. He was known before, even before the foundation of the world. So time, it is a juxtaposition of being known before the foundation of the world, but now he has appeared in these last times for us. So then in 2 Peter, it says, "You therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, be on your guard, so that you are not carried away by the error of unscrupulous people and lose your own firm commitment." So this is, again, Peter saying, using the same word, talking about knowing this beforehand. So it is something that is previously known. So then going back to Romans 8, I just want us to get this because I think this is the same thing as what is happening in Hebrews 11, where it's the hall of faith, and it's since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us approach the throne of grace with confidence. Let us continue forward. Let us throw off the sin that so easily entangles us. Because of all the things that we have seen in the past, because of how God has treated the patriarchs, how he has been faithful to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that we know that he will do this for us and that we can trust in him through all our persecution. So let's read this again, just remembering the definitions of foreknew, those whom he knew before, and predestined, which is who is predestined for what. "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who then is against us? Nobody. Because we can see that God has worked throughout all of Israel's history, that all those who trusted in Christ, Abraham believed and it was counted as righteousness. Isaac believed God and he followed God. Jacob believed God and God named him Israel. So those he predestined to be conformed to Christ, he also called. He named Abram Abraham. He named Jacob Israel. He named them the seed of his promise, or the promise of his seed. He named them the line. He named them his people. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. And this glorification language is talking about honor in a culture that is honor and shame based. This is about the glorification, the name, like these were all nobodies who God called out, whom he justified, and then he glorified. They are now renowned. They are the renowned patriarchs of Israel. David was just the last brother who was watching the sheep. He was a shepherd, the least of his brothers, who now is the pinnacle of kings of Israel. Abram became Abraham, who became the patriarch, the father of the nation. Jacob was one of two who, before they had done anything, as Paul will talk about here in a minute, God chose to follow the line. God called them, and through them brought the seed of Jesus for all of us. And because he was faithful to them, because of how he worked in them to conform them to Christ, and then glorified them and gave them honor, and now that they are in him, that they are with him, as Paul says elsewhere, to be absent from the body is to be present with Christ, and now they are with Christ in glory. In this, we have confidence in all that God will do for us, and that we can persevere, because if God is for us, who is against us? Many people were against all the patriarchs. Many people were against Israel, but as long as they trusted in God, they had nothing to fear. As David stood before Goliath and said that he comes to him in the name of the Lord, the God of hosts, we too can stand in that and say, no matter what the world throws at us, no matter the persecution, no matter the sufferings, we stand in Christ and we stand in his promises. And if God is for us, who can be against us? Nobody. So thank you so much for joining me. If you like this, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.